Hello, class. My name is Christopher Satterwhite, and I'll be your instructor for African American literature. In this course, we'll begin with the earliest of African writings in the Americas and move through the 19th century, our heaviest focus, while landing at the beginnings of what we now see as modern Afrofuturism and the Afrofuturist movement. So, who am I, and how did I come to this field? I've been teaching in higher education for a decade now, and prior to this, I was an instructor in the Navy and Marine Corps. Hoorah to any of the veterans out there. I'm originally from Virginia, and I spent my formative youth in Richmond. As you may know, Richmond was the capital of the Confederacy during the Civil War. Many of the stories that we'll read in this class happen within a few hundred miles of my hometown, in a state where the first Africans were brought under slavery and whose black citizens became among the first freed under the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, on a personal note, this history is part of my own heritage. While it may not be obvious, I'm of mixed heritage, black and white. And I bring this up not to claim any authority over the subject or to stake claim on the literature, as members of my family passed as white to avoid Virginia's very strict racial codes, known today as the one-drop rule. A look at Virginia's history during this period, and it's easy to see how I benefited and how I continue to benefit from this skin privilege in ways that are difficult to calculate. By the same token, though, I know that what I lost through this seemingly simple act is also incalculable. Like many Americans, our histories are complex, mine as well. What I gained personally through these works that we'll study are answers to questions that I'm continuously exploring, and I suspect that you are as well, with which we are truly gifted by these Africans and African American writers who put their words down on paper so that we would know and better understand what it was like to live their lives. Together, we will explore the poems, narratives, and fiction to find what has been lost to many of us, either through personal connection or simply out of curiosity. We will continue this exploration, but always through a literary mindset. We don't simply read these words, we study them, we analyze them, and we think critically about what they tell us from back then, but also today. Now, when I explore the literature of this period, I find Toni Morrison's writing comforting, and I use this as a guide in this exploration. Let me read a paragraph from her 1992 essay, Black Matters, and this is from her book, Playing in the Dark. I'll read directly from this. For some time now, I've been thinking about the validity or vulnerability of a certain set of assumptions conventionally accepted among literary historians and critics and circulated as knowledge. This knowledge holds that traditional, canonical American literature is free of, uninformed, and unshaped by the 400-year-old presence of first Africans and then African Americans in the United States. It assumes that this presence would shape the body politic, the Constitution, and the entire history of the culture has had no significant place or consequence in the origin and development of that culture's heritage. Moreover, such knowledge assumes that the characteristics of our national literature emanate from a particular Americanness, that it is separate and unaccountable from this presence. There seems to be a more or less tacit agreement among literary scholars that because American literature has been clearly the preserve of white male views, genius, and power, those views, genius, and power are without relationship to and removed from the overwhelming presence of black people in the United States. This agreement is made about a population that preceded every American writer of renown and was, as I have come to believe, one of the most furtively radical impinging forces on the country's literature. The contemplation of this black presence is central to any understanding of our national literature and should not be permitted to hover at the margins of the literary imagination. Now, when we explore this period of literature, That's what we're going to be doing. We're going to begin here, and we'll begin with some of the most marginalized voices of their eras, Alauda Equiano and Phyllis Wheatley. And from there, we'll move through a strong canon of writers, moving them from the margins into the whole body, without taking away their unique Black perspectives. When I read the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley or the narratives of Frederick Douglass and Solomon Northup, I feel as if they're like time machines when I read them. The readings may be difficult to read, but they're so important for us to read, especially today. In Douglass's works, we learn what it was like to lose a parent and be sold, something few of us could ever comprehend. In Northup's work, we learn how tenuous freedom was for African Americans during the 19th century, a subject many of us have drawn striking parallels to in our current century. We also have the issues of passing and a rising consciousness of identity in Frances E.W. Harper's Iola Leroy, as told from a Black woman's perspective, as well as Charles Chestnut's Marrow of Tradition, which W.B. Du Bois described as a sociological study of racial violence. In light of the recent openings of the Equal Justice Initiative's museum and the National Memorial for Peace and Justice in Montgomery, Alabama, very close to us, it is an apt time to be reading these works. Lastly, we'll end a little closer to our time, or at least my time, the 1970s classic Kindred by Octavia Butler. Kindred, a novel that's seen as one of the earliest literary works of the Afrofuturist genre, and if you're not familiar with Afrofuturism, we'll study this, but you can also think of the jazz legend Sun Ra, or even Black Panther, the recent film Black Panther. Kindred is a story about a Black woman who finds herself stuck between history and the present, and she's continuously being sucked back into slavery, back into this hell. Through her novel, we'll see the intersections of the past and present and explore the ways in which we are connected to this history. This is how we'll approach these works, not as a journey in the margins of American literature, but as a means of venerating the voices of the mostly long dead, which still speak to us today. Now, before class begins, I want you to watch episode 2 and 3 of the PBS series, The African Americans, hosted by famed literary critic Henry Louis Gates. These episodes will give you a foundational understanding of the history of African Americans from the 1780s until the turn of the 20th century. From there, we'll follow the syllabus. Each week, I'll begin with a PowerPoint presentation, but you should begin also by reading these works continuously. Always be reading. This is a 6-week course, but I'm expected to make this the equivalent of a 16-week course, which means that we're going to have to do a lot of cramming. We're going to be doing a lot of reading and a lot of writing. The readings, for the most part, aren't too long, but you will need to pace yourself because you will be doing a lot of reading and, again, a lot of writing. If it's any consolation to you, I'm doing the readings as well, so I'm not asking you to do anything that I'm also not willing to do. We'll start with the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley in Chapter 2, 1 and 2, from the narrative of Alauda Equiano, both writers of the late 18th century, who died before the year 1800. I wanted to begin with them because literature and culture rarely honor the arbitrary borders that we create, including those of time. Then we'll move to Frederick Douglass. We'll hear Douglass's voice throughout the class, and he'll be someone that we return to constantly during this period. Douglass lived through most of the century, and we'll see this history unfold through his writing, and then see how it resonates today in our current era, and not only in the United States, but across the world. Before the course, however, I do want to add a note of caution. The readings that we go through will be difficult for some of you. I do know this, and I understand that, and I respect this. Not only as you move into not only difficult as far as the readings go, because in the 19th century they wrote in a very different style than we do now, but also, and more importantly, in the subject matter, that despite the style and despite the age and the years, that there are some rough things that we're going to be looking at in these readings. So I should give you a blanket trigger warning that the material we cover will be difficult to read at times, but the narratives are important, and I firmly believe we gain a better understanding of where we are as a people by reading where we have come from as a people. These are our roots, and we are the branches that come from this tree. If you have any questions at all, I encourage you to ask. Look for several emails from me, especially over the first couple weeks as we settle into the online environment. So until then, I want to give you a hearty welcome to African American literature. And again, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. Thank you, and I hope you have a great day.